This is class number 7 of the series, Religious Paradigms, Believing Our Worldview. And if the Bible is true, then there should be evidence of that truth to be found in the world. The evidence presented in this class this morning comes mostly from the following sources. From the DVD, True You number 2, Is the Bible Reliable? With Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. From the book, Redating the New Testament by John A.T. Robinson. And from the book, Eyewitness to Jesus by Carson Peter Tita and Matthew D'Ancona. Using most of Dr. Meyer's outline, we will look at these 4 questions in examining the truthfulness of the New Testament manuscripts. Number 1, were they written in a documentary style? Number 2, was the transmission of these books reliable? Number 3, was their early composition? And number 4, do we have external corroboration for details of the books? So question 1, does the New Testament have a documentary style? The answer is yes and no. The first couple of 100 pages of the New Testament, the first 5 books are historical. The last 150 plus pages are letters with the book of Revelation. The first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are called Gospels. They each tell a history of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. The 5th book, the book of Acts, or Acts of the Apostles, tells the history of the early church. These are the books of history we will be looking at in this class. Luke, the author of the book of Luke, claims to be writing history based on eyewitness testimony. He claims to have investigated everything. From Luke 1 through 4, begin quote, "Since many have begun to write out an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were given to us by those who, from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught." End quote. A comment on the historical validity of the Gospels from N.T. Wright. He says, begin quote, "Over the last 250 years, it's been common coin in Western culture that, oh, you cannot believe what's been said in the Gospels. It's even made into musicals. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so." That skepticism has wormed its way into much modern culture, indeed into many Christian circles, many church circles where they'll say, well, Matthew probably made this bit up, or Luke just added this bit on the end of the parable, or whatever it is. I and others have spent some of the best years of our lives researching what was actually going on in Palestine in the first third of the 1st century A.D., and trying to get inside the minds of 1st century Jews, 1st century Romans, different Jewish parties and movements, etc., etc. And the more that I have tried to do that, the more I found that what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John comes up in 3 dimensions and says, my goodness, this actually belongs. It makes sense. It fits. It gives us very vivid portraits of who these people were and what they were doing. End quote. And Stephen Meyer then comments, begin quote, in other words, what he is saying is there are hallmarks of historicity or a historical style of writing in the New Testament. And remember, again, we're just going to be looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts this morning. What is a documentary style? A documentary style tells us what happened. It is not historical fiction or poetry or mythological writing or a philosophical treatise or literature or even doctrinal exposition like we find in the letters of the New Testament. A documentary style tells the exact truth of what happened without embellishment or exaggeration. A documentary style is usually written in the 3rd person, from God's point of view, as it were.
I just think 3rd person is good.
3rd person. Not 1st person like I or 2nd person like you, but 3rd person. This is what happened. What is not a documentary style? Here's one example from Josephus, because his histories passed through Christian hands and they might have tweaked it a little. From his book Antiquities, begin quote, Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. End quote. Think about it. The adjectives in this passage, like wonderful, are too effusive, like 10,000 are too exaggerated, and the point of view changes when he says amongst us, including himself with the Jews. This is not objective, it's not in documentary style, so we are rightly suspicious of it. However, the unembellished copy of Josephus, which comes through the Muslim world, reads as follows, begin quote, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day." End quote. This is the Arabic version. This is objective, and it's much more of a documentary style, and it's probably originally what Josephus wrote before the Christian scribe got a hold of it and decided he needed to change it a little bit. Question 2, does the document have reliable transmission? The phrase reliable transmission can be confusing. It should mean an extremely high level of accuracy in copying from one copy to the next, preferably without errors. For example, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest Hebrew manuscript of the book of Isaiah we had was dated in the 900s AD. But when the scroll of Isaiah was found from the 300s BC and we examined it, chapter 53 of that book, for example, had exactly 17 letters different, including one 3-letter word missing from the more modern version. After over 1,000 years, the text was essentially, but not perfectly, the same. It had not been rewritten. It had not evolved over the years, as some people had been saying. So in general, the accuracy of transcription used in copying the Bible is phenomenally good, especially after 1,000 years. I mean, to have the same message, without worrying about somebody just making up stuff. Another standard of reliable transmission is measured by how close the copy is to the original in terms of time. So how far back can we go and still find manuscripts of the Greek New Testament? The page illustrated here comes from the Codex or book Alexandrinus from the 400s AD. That's 400 years after Christ's birth. This manuscript contains the complete Old and New Testaments in Greek. The Codex Vaticanus, which is not shown, is also a complete Greek Bible, and it is from the 300s AD. This is a picture of Matthew's Gospel. Papyrus 1, pictured here, is from the early 200s AD. Papyrus 46, 1 Corinthians, which was copied about 150 AD, is part of the Chester Beatty Papyrus collection. The Magdalen Papyrus, and I know it looks like it sounds, you should say Magdalen, but that's American, and British pronounce it Magdalen, just to trick Americans. These are 3 postage stamp fragments of a codex copy of the Gospel of Matthew, a codex being written on both sides of the page and put into a book form. It was originally dated to 300 AD because the first person doing the dating in the 1800s believed that codices or books were not invented until then. He was wrong. Even Roman poets in the first century were urging their clients to buy their works in booklet form. And Paul in 2 Timothy 4:13 says, "Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books or scrolls, especially the parchments or bound pamphlets." Even in the first century, people were beginning to make books which were written on both sides of the page instead of scrolls which were written only on one side of the page. In the in the early 1900s, these three fragments were redated to 200 AD, and then they sat on a display case in the Magdalen Library for the next 50 years. In 1994, a paleographer, an expert in the handwriting styles of Greek manuscripts, named Karsten Tide, investigated these fragments and announced in 1995 that they should be dated between 70 and 100 AD, because the handwriting style found in the manuscript was definitely first century. As of 2010, the debate hinges on where in the 70 to 150 AD range these fragments should fall. This idea that this copy of the book of Matthew might date as early as 70 AD shocked people into realizing that this meant that Matthew's gospel would have been written within the lifetimes of the people who were eyewitnesses to the actual events. This is another early manuscript scrap is the John Rylands fragment labeled P52. It dates between 90 and 120 AD and contains words from John chapter 18. And yet another standard of reliable transmission is the question of how many manuscript copies do we have to match up to the text to ensure that the copies are the same as the original. If you've got, hundreds of copies and they're all exactly identical, you can be pretty sure that you have a copy of the original. How many ancient manuscripts do we have from other famous writers? We have less than 2,400 copies of the manuscripts of Homer 1,000 years after they were written. We have only 330 copies of the manuscript from Euripides. We have only 2 copies of the manuscript Histories by Tacitus over 1,000 years after it was written. We have 10 copies of the manuscript Gallic Wars by Caesar 900 years after it was written. I believe the picture on the screen is from that document. We have only 8 copies of the manuscript History by Thucydides, 1,300 years after it was written. We have only 2 copies of the manuscript Histories by Tacitus, over 1,000 years after it was originally written. By comparison, the New Testament has been preserved in more ancient manuscripts than any other document from antiquity. We have 5,700 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 15,000 manuscripts in other ancient languages like Syriac, Coptic, Slavic, Ethiopic, and Armenian. To quote Stephen Meyer, over 15 of the New Testament manuscripts date to within 150 years of their original compositions, end quote. Just a word about the word manuscripts. When they're talking about New Testament manuscripts, any unique handwritten copy is considered a manuscript, even if it's only the size of a postage stamp. So many of the oldest copies that we have are just little fragments like that. Question 3, does it have early composition? Was the original manuscript authored very close to the time of the events described in the manuscript? Stephen Meyer's arguments for early authorship are based on what he calls the, quote, I guess you had to be there evidence. That is, unless the author was actually there at the time, he could not have gotten all of the details right. So he gives examples of this. After Paul is shipwrecked on the island of Malta, as recorded in Acts 28, he comes before the chief man of the island named Publius. And many centuries later, an inscription is uncovered that names Publius and his exact title, which is chief man of the island. But this specific title would probably not even have been known in other parts of the Roman Empire, so the book of Acts was almost certainly written by someone who had been there on that island at that time. Now, in the Roman Empire, there was a political power struggle between the emperor and the Senate. Some provinces were governed by legates who reported to the emperor. Other provinces were governed by proconsuls who reported to the Senate. And sometimes these governments were switched. For example, Luke writes in Acts 13, verse 6, when they had gone through the whole island, that is of Cyprus, as far as Paphos, they found a magician, a Jewish false prophet whose name was Bar-Jesus, who was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus. End quote. Before 21 BC, the island was an imperial province governed by a legate. After that, it was a senatorial province governed by a proconsul, Luke correctly refers to the guy in charge as a proconsul. This is a 1st century AD inscription, a stone that was found near Paphos, Cyprus, validating the existence of both the man, Sergius Paulus, and his correct title, proconsul. Sergius Paulus is also mentioned on a boundary stone of the Emperor Claudius from 47 AD as one of the curators of the banks and channel of the river Tiber. Acts 18, verse 11, begin quote, "And he," that is Paul, "settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat," end quote. Now from 27 BC to 15 AD, Achaia was a senatorial province governed by a proconsul. From 16 AD to 44 AD, Achaia was an imperial province governed by a legate. Then from 44 AD on, Achaia was again a senatorial province governed by a proconsul. Since Gallio, according to an inscription at Delphi, assumed this office in 51 AD, Luke correctly identifies Gallio as a proconsul, not a legate. Okay, this is stone found in 1871 in Jerusalem. It's a temple warning inscription, and it reads, quote, "No Gentile may enter the dividing walls into the court around the holy place. Whoever is caught will be to blame for his subsequent death," end quote. Josephus wrote in the 1st century, "At the temple there was," quote, "an inscription which forbade any foreigner to go in under pain of death," end quote. Luke records in Acts 21:27, begin quote, "Jews from Asia, upon seeing him," that is Paul, "in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law in this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place.'" They had seen Paul with, I think it was Trophimus, in the city of Jerusalem, and assumed that he had brought him into the temple. More evidence. Luke writes in Luke 3, verse 1, "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene." And we have to wait here because scholars said this can't be right because Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene some 40 years before this, and there cannot have been two men named Lysanias who were both tetrarchs of Abilene. And even though Josephus himself also said that there were two men named Lysanias who were both tetrarch of Abilene, they insisted that Josephus was wrong too, until the following inscription was found, and I believe that's what's on your screen. Quote, "For the salvation of the Lord's imperial, Curion Sebaston, and their whole household, by Nephaeus, a freedman of Lysanias the tetrarch," end quote. Now the Lord's imperial were known to be Emperor Tiberius and his mother Olivia, which dated a second Lysanias as tetrarch of Abilene within the reign of Tiberius. So both Luke and Josephus were entirely correct, and the scholars were wrong. Reasons for dating the book of Acts before 64 AD. There is no mention of the fall of Jerusalem from 66 to 70 AD. There is no mention of the Roman-Jewish war from 64 to 70 AD. The tone towards the Romans is peaceful. There was no mention of the violent persecution of Christians in Rome by Nero in 64 AD. There is no mention of the martyrdom of James in 61 AD, or Paul in 64 AD, or Peter in 66 AD. This pretty much says that Acts would have had to have been written maybe before 60. Otherwise, it would have made note of the fact that some of the main characters of the book of Acts had been killed, but it doesn't say anything about it. And if Acts was written before AD 64, that means the Gospel of Luke was written even earlier, as it says in Acts 1, verse 1, "The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began to do and to teach." I don't know if I told you that Luke wrote both the books of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts. Only he wrote Acts much later than the gospel. We're still on question 3. Does it have early composition? Was the original manuscript authored very close to the time of the events described in the manuscript? In the 1960s, John A.T. Robinson put out a book called Honest to God, which was strongly in support of a late dating of all New Testament manuscripts. At that time, there were many presumptions or paradigms that would push the date of the authorship, indeed the very identities of the authors, into times which are up to hundreds of years after the life of Jesus. But when, 25 years later, he published this book in 1976, some people were alarmed at the about-face he had taken. This book, he says basically, hey, none of the books of the New Testament mention the fall of Jerusalem or the total destruction of Israel. Therefore, all of those had to have been written before 70, and that's something that all of the scholars had been pushing the other direction for 100 years. In the last 2 pages of this book, Mr. Robinson reprints a short letter from his dying colleague, C.H. Dodd. Among other things, Mr. Dodd says, quote, "You are certainly justified in questioning the whole structure of the accepted critical chronology of the New Testament writings, which avoids putting anything earlier than 70, so that none of them are available for anything like first-generation testimony. I should agree with you that much of this late dating is quite arbitrary, even wanton, the offspring not of any argument that can be presented, but rather of the critic's prejudice that if he appears to assent to the traditional position of the early church, he will be thought no better than a stick in the mud. The whole business is due for a radical re-examination. It is surely significant that when historians of the ancient world treat the Gospels, they handle the documents as if they were what they professed to be. But if one approaches them in that way, is not the case for late dating collapse?" End quote. John A.T. Robinson goes through a lot of discussion in his book and concludes by redating the books of Matthew through Paul's letters. He decides that since none of these books mention the monumental event of the Roman Jewish war and destruction of Jerusalem, that all of these books must have been written before that destruction in AD 70, and then he challenges scholars to prove otherwise. He seems reluctant, however, to date any book before AD 40. I think there is another assumption at work here, and that is that there existed a significant period, possibly 10 or 20 years, from the day of Pentecost, that the gospel was spread by verbal preaching only, that Christians did not begin to write down the gospels until some of the apostles were killed. And I believe that that is an incorrect assumption. Question 3, does it have early composition? We're still on that question. Consider the following clues for the Gospels. Clue number 1, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 6, and he wrote this in 53 AD on his third missionary tour, only 20 years after the day of Pentecost. Quote, "So that in us you may learn not to exceed what is written," end quote. I told you where that was, right? 1 Corinthians 4, verse 6. And the phrase, "what is written," implies the written Gospels. Any other interpretation, like the Old Testament, which is fulfilled by Jesus, which has been replaced by a new covenant, or other letters of Paul, which were still largely unwritten, does not make sense. It does make sense that here, only 20 years after the death of Jesus, we apparently have written Gospels. Clue number 2, why, for example, did Paul never write a Gospel? Was it because the Gospels had already been written? Clue number 3, how, for example, was Paul able to go back through the towns on his first missionary journey and appoint elders in the churches to teach the Word, the Gospel, if he had not left written copies of it with them? Are we assuming that the Holy Spirit was endowing those elders with 3 years' worth of memories of Jesus' life and teachings? Clue number 4, all of the title tags on the scrolls or later on books say Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. There is no evidence of a first gospel being labeled just the gospel, only to be changed when another gospel appeared much later. The early church accepted all 4 gospels as equally valid records of the life and teachings of Jesus, and they did not accept later works claiming to be gospels. Consider the following clues for the book of Mark. Mark clue number 1, why did Peter never write a gospel? Tradition has it that the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Peter, that Peter told Mark the events that are recorded in the Gospel of Mark. Why is this reasonable? Mark clue number 2, 1 Peter 5:13 says, "Send you greetings, and so does my son Mark," end quote. Peter calls Mark his son. Was this physically true or only spiritually true? Mark clue number 3, Mark records Jesus praying in Gethsemane, quote, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will," end quote. Mark is the only gospel to record Jesus praying with the words, "Abba, Father." How would he know unless he had been there? And why would he have been there unless he happened to be Peter's son? Mark clue number 4. The author of the book of Mark inserts a very odd event. As Jesus was arrested and the disciples fled, chapter 14, verse 51 reads, quote, "A young man was following him wearing a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked," end quote. Conjecture supposes that this young man may have been Mark himself, otherwise there is no understanding why this was added to the gospel. Mark clue number 5. See the book Eyewitness to Jesus for the details on why the Qumran fragment 7Q5, which is pictured here, has been identified as coming from the Gospel of Mark 6, verses 52 and 53, which reads, begin quote, "They were utterly and completely dumbfounded because they had not seen what the miracle of the loaves meant. Their minds were closed. Having made the crossing, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored there," end quote. Having been found in Qumran, this fragment must date before 68 AD. Also, it is a fragment of a scroll, not a codex. It is assumed that the Gospels were first written on scrolls by Jewish believers and later recopied into codices. There has been and still is great debate and objection to the identification of this fragment with the book of Mark, even though all of the letters match. Mark clue number 6. When Peter was released from prison by an angel, we read in Acts 14, verse 12, quote, "And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark," end quote. Now, if John Mark was actually his son, that might make Mary his wife, which might make the house his house, but Luke does not say this in the book of Acts perhaps because Peter is a wanted man, and if the authorities found out his relationships with other people, they also might be jailed. Mark clue number 7. The Gospel of Mark reads like a diary. Mark includes mostly the miraculous and fantastic events of Jesus' ministry, the kinds of things that a teenage boy would be interested in. His descriptions, especially of the legion, the demon-possessed man, are often longer than the same accounts in the other Gospels. Listen to this. In my opinion, it is entirely possible that the Gospel of Mark was originally written down during the ministry of Jesus himself up to his resurrection. The oldest copies of Mark end with 16 verse 8, quote, "They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid," end quote. But later copies add a summarizing postscript in verses 9 through 20. It's possible that after verse 8, because the believers were gathered together in hiding and praying through the advent of Pentecost, after which the Holy Spirit had come with power, that Mark did not have occasion to add to this book until later, and only when the church began spreading was it copied for distribution to new believers. But whether that's true or not does not make the Bible false or incorrect. Do the Gospels have early composition? Absolutely. Probably within the first 10 or the latest 15 years after the ascension of Jesus, because by year 20, Paul is writing to the people at Corinth not to go beyond what is written. So the written Gospels had already been spread through the churches at that time. Does the book of Acts have early composition? Yes, because there is evidence of an earlier draft version of the book of Acts. It is less polished and considerably shorter than the authorized version. The book of Acts covers a 28-year span from about 30 AD to about 58 AD. In all probability, Luke kept up notes recording the events of the book of Acts, and after Paul was in Rome, re-edited it for publication to be sent to Theophilus. And lastly, question 4, does the historical document have external corroboration? Corroboration part 1, going to talk about evidence for 5 places from the book of John. Corroboration part 2, evidence for 3 people of the New Testament, that is Herod the Great, Erastus the Not So Great, and James the Lord's brother. Corroboration part 3, evidence of 5 people at the trial of Jesus, Peter, Herod, Joseph or Caiaphas, Pilate, and Jesus. Okay, corroboration part 1, evidence for 5 places mentioned in the book of John. This is evidence of Jacob's well. John 4, verse 5, begin quote, "He came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the place of ground that Jacob gave his son Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well." This sign identifies the structure that has been built over Jacob's well, and the picture on the right is of the well itself inside the structure which is built around it. And if you look close, you can see like there's a rope and a bucket, that has a thing, you wind it up, and there's a little hole under the rope. Evidence of the pool of Bethesda. John 5, verse 2, quote, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool which is in Hebrew called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered," end quote. This is what is left of the actual pool, and it does have, or once had, 5 covered porticos. Evidence of a synagogue in Capernaum. John 6, verse 59, begin quote, "These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum," end quote. A first century basalt synagogue. Basalt is a blackish rock that comes out of a volcano. First century basalt synagogue lies buried underneath this fourth century white synagogue in Capernaum. Evidence of the pool of Siloam. John 9, verse 6, quote, "When he," that is Jesus, "had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, 'Go, wash in the pool of Siloam,'" which is translated sent. "So he went away and washed and came back seeing," end quote. In 2005, workmen uncovered this lower pool pictured on the right, which has been identified as the pool of Siloam from the time of Jesus. It is the size of 2 Olympic pools. Scholars now believe it was the world's largest mikvah bath. That is, the people coming to the temple would have to go through the bath before ascending to the Temple Mount. Coins were found in the pool dating from 105 to 76 BC and 66 to 70 AD. So that span of time covers the whole time that Jesus was alive and teaching. This site of the lower pool yellow now. Hello? Sorry. Thank you. Okay. Are we on? Here's evidence of an Arcosoleum tomb like the one that Jesus was buried in Jerusalem. It's called Arcosoleum because there's an arch like over the top, and then they could roll the stone down over the door. Matthew 27, verse 59, quote, "Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away," end quote. Corroboration, part 2, evidence for 3 people of the New Testament, Herod the Great, Erastus the Not So Great, and James the Lord's brother. Herod the First, client king of Judea, reigned from 40 BC to 4 BC. And yes, if these dates are correct, that means that Jesus was born before 4 BC and probably died about 30 AD instead of 33 AD. But scholars argue about this kind of stuff all the time. Josephus wrote a biography of his life, and the massacre of the innocents is a well-known event. If you recall, Herod tried to kill all of the babies under 2 years old in order to stop the Christ from coming, I guess. Herod dramatically enlarged the area of the Temple Mount, built massive walls around the city, and built palaces and fortresses all over the Judea province. Romans 16:23, quote, Erastus, who is the city's director of public works, that is, an aedile, which can also be translated as treasurer, and our brother Quartus send you their greetings, end quote. The name Erastus and his title, Director of Public Works, or aedile, was found on this paving stone. I labeled the letters that are under it so you could kind of maybe see where they are on the rock. But Galatians 1 verse 19, quote, But I, that is Paul, did not see any other of the apostles except James the Lord's brother, end quote. James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader of the Jerusalem church. So they found this ossuary in Jerusalem. An ossuary is this bone box. In Jerusalem from 20 BC to 70 AD, there was a practice among the rich or famous that the family would come back a year after the burial and collect the bones and put them into an ossuary for reburial. The inscription on this ossuary says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. It reads from right to left. The Israeli Archaeological Authority declared that the box was a fraud, and they arrested the collector. His name was Odin Golan. The media picked up on the fraud story, so everyone now assumes that it was a fake, but consider the following points. Point 1, when the Israeli antiquities people said, hey, it's inauthentic, they cited scholars who actually disagreed with that conclusion. Point 2, according to the Geological Society of Israel that also examined the box, the physical features of the box are certifiably 1st century. Point 3, the limestone out of which it's made comes from Mount Scopus, a mountain in Jerusalem. The box itself is authentic. Point 4, the consensus of paleographers, the people who've examined the inscription, is that the first part of the inscription on the right end, which says James, son of Joseph, is certifiably 1st century. Point 5, but beyond that, most of them also agree that the inscription is stylistically done in one hand. It's all the same kind of writing with the same stylistic elements. So if the first part is 1st century, then the whole thing should be 1st century. Point 6, the names Joseph, James, and Jesus are in the right relationship to each other as father, son, and brother. Point 7, if a brother is inscribed on an ossuary, then that brother is even more prominent than the deceased. Point 8, only 60,000 people lived in Jerusalem at that time. What are the odds of there being another James who was the son of a Joseph and was a brother of a Jesus who is very prominent in the 1st century and is not Jesus of Nazareth? But whether or not, the odds are slim, but let's suppose that it was true that there was some other James who was the brother of a Jesus, who was the son of a Joseph, and he got buried in this box. That doesn't make the Bible false. This isn't absolute proof that you have to believe or not believe. Point 9, the patina. The dust and scum on the outside of the box is 2,000 years old, and some of the patina inside the letters on the box, including inside the letters that form the name of Jesus, is also 2,000 years old, making the carved lettering at least as old as the gunk inside of it. So it appears that this is authentic. But whether or not it is authentic does not invalidate the truth of the Bible. Josephus documents the death of James, the brother of Jesus. Quote, as therefore Ananus was of such a disposition, he thought he had now a good opportunity, as Festus was now dead, and Albinus, that is his replacement, was still on the road. So he assembled a council of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned, end quote. But when the Romans arrived and found out what Ananus had done, they removed him from being high priest. Corroboration, Part 3. Evidence of 5 people who were at the trial of Jesus: Peter, Herod Antipas, Pilate, Joseph Caiaphas, and Jesus. 1/4 of the Gospels are devoted to an account of the trial of Jesus and his death by crucifixion. Details are given, officials are named, times and places are identified. Okay, was Peter a real person? Luke 22, verse 60. But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly." End quote. The 4th century AD writing of the pilgrim Egerius says, begin quote, "And in Capernaum, what is more, the house of the prince of the apostles," that is Peter, "has been turned into a church, leaving its original walls, however, quite unchanged." End quote. Graffiti mentioning both Lord Jesus Christ and Peter was found on the walls and dated to the 2nd century AD. This is a picture of Peter's house in Capernaum. So we presume that Peter was a real person to have had a house that he lived in. Luke 23, verse 8, quote, "Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus. He questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate." End quote. Herod Antipas is attested in or mentioned in Josephus's Antiquities and War, Philo's On the Embassy to Gaius, Suetonius's Caligula, and Dio's Roman History, and on coins from his reign, which is what's in the picture is a coin from the reign of Herod. Luke 23, verse 1, begin quote, "Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him. Pilate said to the chief priests and to the crowds, 'I find no guilt in this man,' but they kept on insisting. When he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at the time." End quote. Pilate is spoken of in the writings of Philo, Tacitus, and Josephus, and on coins of the time, and on the stone slab that Pilate himself dedicated with these words, "To the honorable gods, this Tiberium Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated," or had dedicated. And that's what's in the picture, along with a couple of coins from his rule. Josephus, the son of Caiaphas, often referred to just as Caiaphas, was the Jewish high priest from 18 to 36 AD. This Caiaphas was the one who organized the plot to kill Jesus. Matthew 26, verse 57 says, "Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together." End quote. In 1990, 2 miles south of Jerusalem, 12 ossuaries in the family tomb of Caiaphas were discovered, dating to the 1st century. This box contains the bones of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, who, unable to find any witnesses capable of proving that Jesus was worthy of death, demanded that Jesus incriminate himself with the words, quote, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "As you said, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." End quote. And upon these words they condemned him to death. Jesus of Nazareth as a historical person is attested by the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Acts of the Apostles, the New Testament letters, ancient creeds, apocryphal literature, Gnostic Gospels, early church fathers, the Jewish Mishnah, and historians of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Historians who mention Jesus Christ include Titus Flavius Josephus, Publius Gaius Cornelius Tacitus, Mara bar Serapion, Flavius Justinus, Justin Martyr, Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, Pliny the Younger, and Lucian of Samosata, and Celsus. So given all of this evidence of the actual existence of the people and places mentioned in the New Testament, we should probably believe that the New Testament account of history is true. We'd like to thank you for coming, and you are dismissed until services in 15 minutes.